Okay.
Got it.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to introduce you today to the amazing former Tarot School for Liberation student, TA, and friend, Christine Rose. Hi, Christine.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here. I'm very honored to be on the podcast and it's just good to see you. So this is really
Yeah, it's great
great
to see
day.
you. You're such like a sparkling personality. I've been like so excited to introduce people to you. And
Gosh,
yeah, it's great to talk to you. So do you want to tell people a little bit about who you are?
yeah, who am I? I don't know.
I know, what a question.
I know. Well, it's a little complicated of an answer, I guess. I'm fat, queer, Chicana babe, just living my life out in Southern California right now. Previously, I probably would have introduced myself by my profession, which was doing a lot of work related to the food industry, the culinary industry, personal chef work, and doing like events for like, my own retreats or other people's retreats, things like that. But I've taken a hiatus from that. And so I am giving myself some grace during this period where I, at the core of it, am just a very like creative individual, witchy individual. And like I'm letting myself be kind of intuitively led during this period of taking a break from industry that I burnt out on, to be honest. And so we'll see
Yeah.
what creative medium comes out of me next. But right now, I'm just kind of letting myself exist and that being enough.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a weird way to answer that question.
No, it is not. Very, very authentic. That's what I love about you. You're so like, here I am. This is me. Take it or leave it.
Yeah.
You're a very like authentic person, but I think you naturally make people feel really happy. Well, I don't happy in 2022. What does happy mean?
Yeah,
You
I
make
know,
people
truly.
comfortable and I think you like brighten up a room. Like,
Aww.
yeah. So anyway, we were just trying to figure out when it was. I feel like you were in one of the first iterations of Tarot School for Liberation in maybe 2020, like summer.
Yeah.
And then you came back in winter of 2021 and you were part of the only advanced Tarot School for Liberation that I ever taught, and you were one of the TAs, and you were the TA for Swords. So I wanted to bring you on to talk about that, but first I would just like to talk about what you got out of Tarot School for Liberation. Like, what was tarot like for you? Like, what card did you choose, or not choose, but like in Tarot School for Liberation, I chose one card for every, like the classes were 22 people and I chose one of the major for everyone. So yeah, if you want to share anything about that.
Yeah, so we were talking about just for a second before we started recording, but I mean, it's gonna sound dramatic, and I swear I'm not like an infomercial, but really taking that course like legit changed the trajectory of my life. And it was really, I remember that it was in like summer of 2020 when we all were kind of, I think, like turned upside down, like in this like new world of like COVID and like lockdown. And I was really feeling adrift, as like everyone was, and had been doing tarot just as part of my own personal practice of like, I pull cards for myself and maybe would pull cards for friends, but didn't really have like a lot of confidence around it. And went into the course thinking like, oh, I'm gonna have like this, I don't know what, like, and it's funny because it's the opposite of that. Like, it's like you teach it as like this intuitively led, like learning to lean into your intuition. And I went into it being like, oh, I'm going to come out like an expert and, like have all the cards memorized, like having this very like academic viewpoint of it. Right. And perfectionist viewpoint, and like part of my own like decolonizing work that was very healing for me to be in a course that was like the emphasis constantly that you reiterated is like, at the end of the day, you're the expert in this. Like, it's your intuition, and it's about getting in touch with your intuition and using tarot as a medium for like, connecting with your guides or connecting with whatever your like higher power is, like whatnot, and really trusting your own kind of interpretation of the cards. And that was so liberating for me to like learn it from that perspective. And it became such a really like personal, it really deepened my personal practice of like it becoming a tool for healing. And really like, I think it it made me more confident in myself to be able to be like, you know, the messages that are coming through, I can trust them instead of being like, well, I don't really know what I'm doing. And like, no, 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 and like, you know, constantly maybe leaning on the guidebook or being like, well, I'm not an expert in this. Like, you know, when I would do readings for friends, like that kind of like constant imposter syndrome that was like self-fulfilling. It really forced me to kind of like face that head on and be like, bro, like you're good. Like, but it was really cool to have that experience. And the course itself was just like the way that you structured it. And, you know, all of the courses since then that I've been a part of or like TA'd, I like that it is so collaborative, you know, like your dissemination of the knowledge is like invaluable to me because I'm like a little sponge, like with the way that you describe stuff and the lens through which you do. I'm like, yes, like it's everything I love. Like my little like social justice heart is just like beating out of my chest when you're like describing your perspective on cards. But then such a large part of the course is also this collaborative thing with the other classmates. And, you know, I created friendships like in that course where it was really cool to, you know, when we'd have our breakout sessions to be able to kind of like be pulling cards for one another or, you know, reflecting on like whatever we were going over in like the lecture that day. And it really felt like it was more of this like community building thing than it was like, you know, you just sitting up there and being like, "Mer, mer, mer," like here's the lecture, like everybody just like shut up, here's your homework. Like it was not that way at all, which was very refreshing coming from like an academic background. I was like, oh, this is lovely. Like, and it was, yeah, it was just such an overwhelming like positive experience. And I remember when you asked me, I think it was because I was enrolling in the advanced course, and then you'd asked me to TA for the beginner course that was like I think happening like concurrently or very close thereafter.
I feel like, sorry to interrupt you, but I feel like you asked me, but I was manifesting you asking me. I was like, I put out the word like I'm looking for 4 TAs, and
oh, you're right.
that, yeah, because I asked Aisha and Emily, which shout out to Aisha and Emily and Yasmina and Viv. But I was like thinking of like people that I was like, I want those people, but I'm not sure if they're interested. And then you emailed me and I was like, yes.
I was literally so nervous. I was like fangirling so hard and was like, I don't know, like if I'm worthy, like I'm just like a little like lame-o student, but you were like, yeah, like you'd be great. And I was like, oh my God. And yeah, because again, it was like, you know, that, and it's hard to shake. Like imposter syndrome is like always a thing for me. And so it was like, you know, me again feeling like, oh, I'm out of my depth. Like there's people that like read professionally that are like in the course or are, you know, TAs. And I was like, I'm just a little person. Like, I don't know. Like, but
we all are just little you know, that's all any of us are.
See, that's why I love you. You're like,
thanks.
It's very like, you're very reassuring.
Thank you so much for all your compliments and like kind words. I'm kind of like embarrassed. I'm like, this isn't an infomercial.
Oh my God, that's why I prefaced with that. I was like, I swear this is gonna sound like an infomercial, but I promise you it's not. Like,
need to put like the cheesy music.
I was not baited like before this interview, I promise. No, but it was awesome. And then when I TA'd the course, and I think it was like happening at the same time that I was in the advanced course. That was when each TA, I think you mentioned this, so I'm repeating you, forgive me, but it was like we were assigned a suit that we were going to like focus on, so that, right, isn't that how it works? So then it was like we were kind of the mentors or whatever for the students in the beginner course, that if they had questions about like, oh, I have questions about swords, it's like Christine's your person to like go to. And so I think that's what it was too. I remember requesting if I could do swords because I already was feeling just such a pull towards that suit, like in general. And then my love for it just like deepened exponentially after I focused on that suit specifically when I was TAing for the course, because I really then, you know, wanted to really deepen my knowledge of it so that I could be of service to like the other students. And that process, it was a trip. And this, again, it's like, this is going to sound like a made for TV movie, or like I'm making this up or like something, but like I promise I'm not. Like I was, and you, Karina, can attest to this because I was telling them in real time as this was happening. I was like living through that suit, like as I was in the advanced course and as I was TAing the beginner course, where I really, I think it's kind of weird to start in this order, but I think that I honestly was having like an 8 of Swords moment where I was in what I now came to realize was a very abusive, like toxic relationship. And in general, just like beyond just that, like relationship and that marriage that I was in, just kind of interpersonally across the board, like me feeling like I maybe had to be the certain version of myself that was a little more like passive, and that idea of being like blindfolded and bound and like not really having access to like maybe the mental strength that I knew that I possessed. But I, you know, it was kind of a little, not, I hate to victim blame, but a little bit of my own doing, in the sense that like I didn't really realize the autonomy that I had in that moment. And it really was then a 9 of Swords moment, big time, like big time, like when I was, like I said, in the very beginning stages, I think even of taking the advanced course and TAing for the other one, where I just kind of like I spent a week alone, and I don't know why. And it was one of those things where it was like I was getting pings and I just honored it, right? Like I was like, I just need to be alone. And I'm a very like extroverted, like I always like to have people around, like da-da-da. So it was out of left field that I felt called to like be alone. And I wanted to spend this week alone. And I immediately like had this kind of visceral reaction in my body of like I had like really bad stomach issues and like just certain like physical things that all of a sudden were like lifted when I was alone. And I was like, like what's going on here? And it was kind of like, like something like, you know, I can't really ignore that like in my body. Like, why is it that when I'm alone, I'm feeling a lot better, like physically and mentally? And so then I really upped the ante and was like, I'm going to spend this whole month by myself. I was like, I want to take a whole month to just like be alone. And I was kind of at that point kind of being like, oh, I'm in my hermit, you know, I kept pulling hermit card. And during that time when I was alone, that was when that 9 of Swords moment really happened for me, where when I had distance from that relationship, it was big time. Like, you're waking up to the nightmare, girl. Like, it was like, I was processing like 15 years worth of trauma that I had just kind of like shoved down, and, you know, maybe had been in that kind of state of being like blindfolded, like the 8 of Swords, like just kind of being like, you know, not really facing what was going on and feeling like I'm in danger, right? Like my body was having this visceral reaction of like, I feel sick to my stomach when I'm around this person, but I couldn't like pinpoint why. And it was really that I had, once I was alone and gave myself that space, I had, this like kind of way 9 of Swords moment of just being like, oh shit. And like, I can't unsee what I've seen now, you know, and I can't go back. And so at that point, it was really like, and for many months, I think, then transitioning to like a 10 of Swords moment where it was major ego death, right? Like I had to really like kind of kill this, like, or allow to this former version of myself to die, or I don't know, like it was very much like huge parts of my life like had to shift and had to just be turned like completely upside down. And it was, you know, not an easy process. There was nothing about that was smooth, or, you know, it had this kind of twinge of like violence to it, or, you know, maybe what you associate with that imagery of like the 10 of Swords of me just kind of laying there like bleh, like but it was so necessary. And part of the beauty of the fact that I was working so closely with all of the swords during this whole process is that I was really hyper fixated on like, what is the medicine in these cards? And that in general, you know, like before that, and I think just across the board, people are kind of like, you know, you pull a sword like card and you're like, ooh, like, and you know, and it a little bit it is, right? Because it's like uncovering hard truths or facing hard truths that maybe you are it's difficult to hear. It's difficult things to kind of like process, right? Like none of these things are walks in the park. But it was, and it did have this sense of kind of like 6 of Swords where it's like, I know we talked about that through the lens of like that card being maybe you're having to do like a caretaker role or something like that. And I really viewed it in that moment as like, I'm kind of having this moment for myself, that like that child on the boat is like my inner child. And like, I'm having to do this really kind of difficult work right now, but it's necessary and I have to. And it was really healing to be that kind of dive that deep into the swords when I was personally going through such a total like upheaval of my life, because it, instead of it just being like, yeah, this is a nightmare, right, and just sitting in that 9 of Swords moment, I really kind of allowed myself to continue to cycle through like 4 of Swords. I kept pulling that like constantly, because it was like, yeah, you're changing a lot, you're seeing a lot, you're the blindfolds off, like you're facing a lot of hard truths, and I'm taking action, right? Like I am, not just sitting on that knowledge, but at the same time, it was kind of like reminding me this gentleness of like, okay, like, but chill though too, like calm down, like take a rest. Because I tend to be very kind of like, I make a decision and I'm like, okay, let's go. And, very like action oriented, it was needed to some degree in that moment, right? Because it was kind of like, I have to change things drastically. And I did. But it was also there was a lot of medicine and healing, kind of moments of healing within the suit too, of being like, bringing me back down to earth a little bit, and being like, really just seeing my own journey constantly reflected in the progression of that entire like suit. And that was really cool. I mean, it was a horrible time. It was like very traumatic, like kind of wild time of my life, but it was also really cathartic to have that, like my tarot practice to lean on, and to be able to, because like I said, have already built that foundation in the beginner course, really lean into my intuition and trust it, and not be like, well, why do I keep pulling 4 of Swords? It must just be that I'm not shuffling the deck good enough. Like it was like, no, it's because like what you need to hear, dude. So like just honor that. So yeah, big long story of like,
love it.
Giant infomercial of how Karina changed my life. No.
Oh my goodness. Well, I didn't change your life. I didn't change anyone's life. Like I held space for you to change your life.
Yes.
That's how I feel about it. Because you were not by any means the only person that was going, especially during that winter of 2021, for some reason. There were multiple people that were like, I'm breaking up with my partner of 10 years because I realized it's abusive. Like a lot of people from that class were saying that, or they were, there was a lot of transformation. But again, like I think that I always feel weird complimenting myself. I think that I do have a talent for space holding and helping people access their own healing energy, but I don't think it's like me as an individual. But thank you, Christine.
Yes.
Thank you for the compliment. I'll take it.
Yeah.
And there was a few things, like, thank you for sharing all of that. There was a few things that you said, and the patrons voted on the Ace of Swords. But when I got that, I was like, I want to talk about the whole suit. And I immediately was like, Christine, I need to ask Christine, because you have, and I loved how one thing that you shared a lot during class, and like with the beginner students or the first session students, was about like your history as an academic and that perfectionism, and the way that Swords, people tend to think Swords is about like pain and suffering, and it is, but then really it's about knowledge and ego and empowerment and power. So when you think about it like that, you're like, well, how does power corrupt? How does ego turn into pain? How does perfectionism hurt us? So I think like there's a lot to be said in that suit. And I also really relate to it as someone who also is a recovering perfectionist who's been really hard on myself throughout my life. So like I relate to that one and as a trauma survivor, as someone that's experienced trauma as well, and like similarly, only in my mid 30s, like really woke up to how traumatizing my life has been and how much I've been disassociating really only in the last couple, also that class changed my life too, So anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
We were all going through it. It was a wild time. Yeah. I'm glad we had each other.
Yeah. And we're still all going through it, like, I don't know if it's going to change like the way things are, but we're all, trying to get stronger. So I would love to hear, actually there was something that you said, And I do want to hear sort of your thoughts about the Ace of Swords. I have some of my own to share, but you said something that like resonated with me where you said not to victim blame, but I was thinking about like how I could do things differently. You said something like that. And
Yeah.
I think that comes up in the Suit of Swords because obviously when we are a survivor of trauma or when we are the victim of harm, you know, like some people prefer the word survivor for everything and don't like the word victim ever. But when someone goes through something, yeah, it can be very counterproductive. And this is my viewpoint. And it can be harmful for someone else to ask you what you did wrong. But I think if you want to ask yourself that, that's valid. That's kind of how I feel. Like if something terrible happens to you and someone says to you, and I've been here, what do you think you could have done differently for this not to happen? I'm like, not talk to you ever again for the rest of my life. Bye. You know, but if I ask myself that question, I think that can be healthy. I don't know if that's weird. What do you think about that?
I've not, you know what? I appreciate this conversation so much because that you're putting words to what I have not been able to conceptualize verbally. Because yeah, there's for sure. And I've, you know, had therapists that I've had to like walk away from because it's like, they'll kind of, you know, be like, man, what could you have done differently? I'm like, I hate you.
Yeah.
But I think that that's the thing. That's why I really love tarot so much as a tool for like personal healing, because that entire journey, right? And that like shadow work ultimately that came up, it was so personal. And it was something that like only I had the authority to put that lens on myself or my own behavior when I felt like it. And when I don't feel like it, I don't. You know what I mean? Like it's a very sensitive thing. And I think you're right that like it feels okay if it's coming from like internally, but a lot of times if it is coming externally, it can come off as very just like judgmental or not like what is the word, I'm like invalidating of like your experience. And so what I appreciated too, because we talked about this in the course, because we're like, you know, where does this come up specifically with the Suit of Swords when you're, you know, when and if you're doing readings for other people and really looking at it through this like trauma informed lens. And I remember having a lot of conversations about that, and you know, really the importance of like your verbiage and how you're like presenting this idea like to a client and kind of like, you know, reading the room, or you know, like not necessarily like, you know, pulling an Eight of Swords or someone and be like, well, you know, like you could have caught your own blindfold, like what are you doing? Like that's like so insensitive. But it's like maybe, you know, like you're saying, holding space, to just be a space holder and be like, this is something that came up, like, you know, it could be indicative of this, like da 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 da, like kind of giving it to them and being like, how does this resonate with you? And if they want to, you know, the person that's receiving the reading is like, oh yeah, you know, like I feel like this is a kind of sign that I'm getting of like, you know, maybe I have more autonomy in the situation, or like da da da, beautiful, lovely. If they're like, yeah, what I'm getting is like, you know, I'm kind of just a victim and I'm bound up and like da da da, if that's what they're getting from it, beautiful, lovely. Like, you know, the medicine in it can be drastically different for each individual person. And I think it's like a fine line, right, between like offering up kind of explanations of what could be coming up when that card is pulled versus being like, well, and like, you know, kind of like telling someone like how it translates into their life. Because it is like, I think the swords are a very like emotionally charged set of cards that like when they come up in a reading, people can have a kind of like knee-jerk reaction to it. And I think that it's important to allow people to have that reaction and then be like, what's coming up, you know, like letting other people like have their own kind of like space to sit with that card and sit with like what's coming up for them. So yeah, I'm like, I loved when we had conversations about that in the course. I'm glad we're talking about it again now, because that I think is so important, especially with these kind of like more heavy like cards that can come up.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, you just brought so many things to my mind. Like, for example, you know, you sharing about having survived and like left a long-term abusive marriage, makes me think about, when we're talking about being a survivor, being a victim, not blaming the self, not invalidating the self, not having others invalidate you. The thing is that I kind of came up for me is then if you go to the extreme, like, yeah, we need to acknowledge when something is not our fault. And then also, you don't want to take it to victim complex, because the thing is, like, that's, and I was thinking about that just now because you think about that as a quality of abusers is having a perpetual victim complex that allows them to always see their harm doing as like somebody else's fault,
Yeah,
so it's
justified.
interesting. And I think like for me as a survivor, something that's been big on my healing journey is I realized, and I talked about this in the last episode actually, that I only recently realized that I was like writing stories to make excuses for the people that had been abusive to me. Like they were complicated people and they weren't bad people. They just were going through something. And all that did was like invalidate myself and take away my humanity. So, like, for me, I had to give myself permission to be like, yeah, like maybe when I was younger, I didn't have my own safety or my own boundaries in mind. And I maybe put myself in vulnerable situations that led to violent and awful and traumatizing things happening to me. But that doesn't mean it's my fault, and it's sort of like that idea, I don't know if you've heard that quote or that phrase they say that like, and they say a woman, but I don't want to say that because that's too binary. Like a person could be laying in the street, passed out and naked, and they would not get assaulted unless someone there was a sexual assaulter or like yeah.
Yeah, I haven't heard that, but I love
Yeah.
that because it's so true. And that it's like I resonate so much with what you're saying about like, you know, looking back and being able to be like, not what role did I play in it, but like what circumstances allowed me to stay in a situation that was very harmful to me. And
Mhm.
how do I now move forward that I don't allow situations or people like, I mean, and obviously there's no way to completely control that, right? Some things are out of our control,
Right.
but it is really like and what I still do, the card that I always am kind of like became my little like hero card or whatever is Queen of Swords, because I was like, I really value that I value that I have this history, that I have, that I've experienced trauma, or that I always have kind of had this like sharp tongue, and that I've always been kind of like intellectually minded. And, that's what took me down the road of like academia, which turned out to not be my cup of tea because of like all the bad things that entails. But to really continue to try and see, okay, well, how can I still embody this energy of the swords and the strength that comes with like seeing truth, speaking truth, and setting boundaries, and doing it in a way that like benefits me and that is setting me up so that I don't get it, I don't get myself into that cycle again of being like blindfold on and feeling kind of powerless. Because I don't, that to me, that's what it boils down to, is that like I gave my power away. I
Mhm.
disconnected from my power. And that sucked, it felt shitty, and I didn't know how shitty it felt until I kind of piece by piece tried to kind of reclaim it. And it's like so important to me now to protect it, right? And that is swords energy to me, is like, when I think of Queen of Swords, I think of like that kind of fluidity and softness that I still crave and want to embody just as part of my own kind of healing journey from trauma, and from, maybe like that like hyper kind of masculine energy of like academia, or perfectionist culture, like white supremacy culture. It's like I don't want to have as much rigidity as I have had related to my like kind of like intellectual domain. So I do appreciate the kind of like softness that like the water energy that like Queen of Swords embodies, while also still being like, but I don't take any shit. Like it doesn't take away the fact that like I see things for what they are, I call things for what they are, and I am a protector like of myself and of those in my community, those who I love. And that feels so important to me to like try and embody that energy. And, you know, that was another thing that was medicine in working with the swords, was to kind of be like, you know, maybe right now I don't, and for sure when I was going through all of that, I didn't feel like Queen of Swords at all. I was just like, I'm big and like barely above water. I don't even know. Like,
Yeah.
I'm just like treading water, you know, like I'm in the boat, like of Six of Swords, like just kind of, but it was like my little like beacon of hope, right? Like it was like I would put that card on my altar and be like, you know, this is the energy I want to embody. This is who I know is deep down inside me somewhere, and is deep down inside like all of us. And it just felt out of reach in that moment, and it felt out of reach for like years and years. And that card has really become a kind of like a way for me to self-reflect and be like, you know, where I'm at now, and as I progress further in my healing journey, to be able, you know, now to feel closer to that energy feels really good. Like to be able to be like, yeah, you know, I do embody that energy. I am in that like energy now. That feels like a really cool thing, to be able to see that kind of tangible change and be able to look back on like my journey of progression through working with the suit and just like tarot in general. Like, so yeah, it's just like, you know, the medicine within each and any of the cards, and you know, not just this suit, but like this is the one that like clearly resonated the most with me. The medicine in it is immense. Like it's, you know, it's really such an amazing tool for personal healing. And I think for others too, you know, if they're open to it and ready to kind of face some hard truths head on, the swords are where you're at. And that's why, you know, when you mentioned that it was the Ace of Swords, I kind of like had an immediate kind of little like chuckle, and I'm like, yeah, that's where it starts. Like I'm like, yeah, Ace of Swords is where it starts. That's when you realize that like there's a problem, or you know, you're needing to see things from a new perspective. And but that's the tip of the iceberg, you know what I mean? Like if you really like see it through, you'll see yourself, or whatever the situation, can really have the capacity to progress through all of the cards in the suit if you're very like honest with yourself or honest about the situation.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there is so much medicine in the suit of swords, and it is so much about ego. And I think that's why I love it. And I love your analysis of it. And you know, the thing with the ace is it's the beginning, you know, so like when the ace, any of the aces are super positive, in my opinion, although I hate, you know, I hate saying positive and negative. It's very it's like a I can't think of a word for it, but the image I see is like a sun peeking through the clouds rising. That's very like ace to me. And the ace of swords is empowerment through knowledge and leadership. But somehow, and that's what I think about like with capitalism, you know, and even not with capitalism, I think with government in general, because there's a lot of people right now who are like, which I'm not knocking this, who are like, you know, moving further and further to the left, and they're like communism, socialism. But the thing about that is you look at those countries, a lot of them, you know, colonized countries that became socialist and communist, and then those leaders who started out being like very much about workers' rights and like indigenous rights and like egalitarian ways of being, get access to power and become corrupt dictators. So it's like, I think that it doesn't matter what structure of government you have, like the thing about power is that it corrupts. And there's that saying, you know, I don't remember who said it, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the thing about the ace is like, what happens if we stayed at the ace and we didn't let us get to like the seven, you know, the seven where you're trying to cheat someone, or the five, you know, where there's like an ego death. And instead of dealing with that ego death, or instead of dealing with that disappointment, you seek revenge in the seven, you know. So I think that's the thing about the suit of swords. It like, and I talk about that a lot in Tarot School for Liberation, the way that it is like a sequence. It is a sequence kind of that tells a story. And what I love about the Ace of Swords is it tells me when it comes up that there's an option for a new way this time. Like we could take it a new way if you turned around at the two, maybe even if you turned around at the three, if you turned around at the five, you know. I love the four. I think the four is like a very evolved archetype. But yeah, is there any other, I guess, thoughts that you have about this?
Well, something that came up for me when I was thinking about Ace of Swords was I was thinking about, like you mentioned, that there's, again, great that people are waking up to this, but, I would say since, summer of 2020, and then it's happened again now more recently, there's a kind of wave of people who are maybe becoming more aware of like social justice issues, like very broadly, right? And realizing that it's like, oh, this requires like we need to think about things differently, or like this isn't working, like the current system isn't working, or like, da, 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 da. And I think what came up for me when I was thinking about that is that I think a lot of people are kind of rushing towards what I think of being a little bit of like Knight of Swords energy, where it's like people that are, they're not activists, or they're not really familiar with like the practice of like, you should be supporting like Black and brown folks that are already been organizing for like years and years. And you see a lot of like performative activism and just kind of like yelling. And, it makes me think of like the slew of like white women that were dressed as like Handmaid's Tale characters at these like protests for like Roe versus Wade. And that the energy of, of seeing like, oh, I have this new knowledge, or this new like truth, right? This new light bulb that came on in my head about like, this isn't okay, and wanting to kind of like champion or like fight and like scream atop the mountaintop, but it's a little like misguided, right? And I feel that like during this whole period, like in the past couple of months in particular, it's felt like there's a lot of Knight of Swords energy just kind of like swirling around. And, I agree that in general that like, power and that kind of like being able to be the authority on like dissemination of knowledge or whatever can tend to corrupt people. But I think that something that's really important right now is to kind of seek out people that are already embodying that King of Swords energy, people that are organizing, people that are focusing on like, community network and like grassroots like movements. And instead of like, waking up to this idea and having your own kind of like personal Ace of Swords moment and being like, that's great that you have that energy and that you're like, yeah, fuck the system, like I want to change everything. But it's like, but then kind of like, fall in line, like be more of a page and defer to your king, and allow yourself to be in that kind of like sponge state, or kind of like, learning state, and deferring to your elders, for lack of a better like term, and so I think that it's really timely right now in particular, because there's so many people that are just kind of like, maybe new to like dipping their toes into these like issues, and the rage is there, like the upset is there, the like desire for change is there. But I think that a lot of times this kind of like, well, now I know that this is wrong and I'm gonna yell about it, and it's like, I saw a video just this morning, I think on TikTok, Imani, I think Crutches and Spice, I don't know if you follow them. They're a Black disabled like creator and advocate, and they stitched or duetted a video where it was a white woman like in a church, presumably some Christian or some denomination of that like church, and during like a church session, I don't know why I can't even think of the name, during a sermon or like something, they like ripped off their clothes and had like, I don't know, like stuff on their body, and were like, it's my body, my choice, like, yelling. And this creator like stitched the video or duetted the video and was like, this is great, like, I'm all for performance-based like activism, but where was the follow through? Were you there handing out resources on like local organizations that could help like combat like what's going on? Like, were you handing out pamphlets on like reproductive resources? Like, you know what I mean? Like there was no action based, like there was nothing offered to the people there to actually like take action. It was more of this kind of like, I'm mad and I'm yelling about it, and like, and there was no like meat to it, and I feel like in general that I was just seeing a lot of that right now. And it's like, wouldn't it be great if we could channel all of that energy into something productive? And I think, you know, we can, but it's an uphill battle and it requires a lot of shadow work, right? Maybe it requires a lot of
Yes.
people to be like, yikes, am I in a 5 of Swords moment and just want to be right for the sake of being right? And I'm talking over Black and brown voices and I actually need to shut the fuck up. Like, you know, and like people
Yeah.
need to be very real with themselves about that. And I don't know how many people are willing to. So that's for me kind of what came up when I was really trying to think about like Ace of Swords and what does that progress into? What does that branch off into? And I kept thinking there's a lot of people just jumping straight from Ace of Swords to Knight of Sword and like just skipping all the in between, right? And I don't know what your thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about court cards and like knights showing up in that way. I feel like because you know knights are air, which can like move really quickly and unintentionally. So I feel like we talk a lot about that, and I feel like you know, Knight of Swords to me because it's air, it's knowledge. I feel like the thing that I always think of, and I love your example, you know, because yeah, the reproductive justice stuff brought up a lot of white women ignorance, I'll say, which I am not, you know, I've been there, y'all. Been there, done all the shitty white woman, quote unquote, non-woman things in my life. Like I mean, you know, I've never called the cops on a BIPOC. Like can proudly say that. But I've done a lot of like self, you know, whatever, we don't need to get into that. But like
been there.
Yeah, like I just want to say that, and like I am not above anybody. But I think like the Knight of Swords to me, I think about like people that like repost memes without like fact checking them, or like the lack of fact checking even on the left. You know, obviously that was happening a lot during the last administration, and like probably that, you know, I'm sure this administration as well, although I feel like this administration is more like gaslighty and condescending and the last one was just like in your face hateful. But I think like, you know, that spread of misinformation in order to invoke passion and anger, and yeah, like we do need to find ways to channel our anger, but you know, you bring up a good point. Between those two things, with the Suit of Swords, we have the opportunity to look at our most shadow and wounded parts. We have the opportunity to see how we're showing up harmful or how we are being harmed, you know, because, you know, and in the last episode I did with Krista Venora, we were talking about how, you know, you can't be like, I never want to harm anyone again. Instead, you have to expect that you will harm again. You will harm because we are all human and we're all learning. And like, we're, you know, perfectionism is not helpful because it doesn't really exist.
Yeah. You know, I think that everything that we've talked about is to me what keeps coming back is like the swords offer this beautiful moment for self-reflection in a very honest way, and if you're willing to like sit with that and you know, see the ways in which you can grow from it, it offers like, you know, it offers endless opportunities to do so. But I think that the most important thing is that, yeah, that you're willing to take that journey rather than like getting Ace of Swords and then be like, woo, I'm going to jump over to the court. Like, you know what I mean? That you have to really be in a space where you can like lean into that kind of, you know, kind of heavy like shadow work sometimes. And, you know, it's not fun to do, but I think it's really necessary. And I think especially when you're talking about, you know, through that lens of like, I will harm, you know, I'm not going to never like do something harmful or say something harmful. Like I cannot avoid doing that in the future. But I think the more that you do this kind of like very real, it kind of reminds me of like the swords energy is like calling yourself in or like, you know, checking yourself, right? And I think that plays out into like your relationships with other people where maybe you are the perpetrator of harm, but also like we're talking about too of like, how am I allowing harm to myself, right? Because I'm not being real about my own ways that I'm like self-sabotaging or allowing others to harm me as a form of like self-harm in a weird way. You know, there's so much to like unpack there if you're willing to take a hard look in the mirror, which I think a lot of people since 2020 have been moving towards that direction, you know, like I think a lot of people have been having really hard kind of like talks in the mirror, and you know, a lot of ego death has been going on, I think, collectively since this whole like thing began. Um, and I think that really my thought is kind of inviting, if people aren't there yet, like, it's okay, come on in, the water's
Yeah.
fine. I mean, the water's choppy, but like you can swim, there's a boat, like,
Yeah.
you
Six of
know.
Swords reference.
Yeah, yeah,
Rich white Republican men are not in the shadow workplace.
Woo.
They're like
Oh,
giving
no.
steroids to their egos. But yeah,
Good
not
Lord.
even Republican.
I know.
Democratic, all white,
Yeah,
all
I know.
over.
That's why I totally agree with what you said of like, I kind of liked, you know, before when it was like the previous administration, it was very like on their sleeve, like, you know, like they were not trying to hide anything of what they were. And I, you know, I think that a lot of like BIPOC folks in general will echo this sentiment that I have as well, which is like, I prefer someone who's an in my face, like Confederate flag, like racist, you know what I mean? Because I'm like, oh, cool, I'm going to stay away from you, versus, you know, the type of stuff that I experience in an academic setting where it's all white liberals that, you know, have like safe space stickers like on their fucking offices or whatever, and then turn around and are constantly microaggressing against me. And it was like, that felt more dangerous. It was more dangerous. It was more harmful ultimately than some of the like blatant in your face, like discrimination that I've experienced, you know, when I, you know, was with, you know, around someone who's like, you know, has a Confederate flag or a Trump flag and like says some weird, stupid comment. It's kind of like, well, no shit. Like you expected a little bit from them. And so I think that another important thing of why there's such like relevance to the swords right now is really our ability individually and collectively to be able to discern, right? Like we need to really still be on guard. I hate to say that, but it's true, of like, you know, a lot of people had illusions about like, oh, you know, Trump's out of office, everything's dandy. And I was like, yeah, you think so? Like, you know, and like basically keeping our sense of discernment very sharp, keeping our swords, our ability to see through bullshit and like see to the truth of things and understand you know, things like power dynamic and how it's being corrupted. And that's important to not like sleep on that. And I think a lot of times people, you know, and because it's a lot more comfortable to be complacent and trusting, but it's not what we need right now. We need to not now is not the time to like, you know, stop that energy that everyone kind of like had in you know, voracious sense. Like during the Trump administration, people were very like riled up, and then it was like a little bit of like, oh, like when the new president came in, and I'm like, are you kidding? Are you doxing me? Like so yeah, I think, you know, particularly right now, swords is, and the energy in the entire suit is so relevant for introspective, like, you know, personal shadow work, but also just like how you kind of navigate the world and our kind of like political landscape, social landscape right now is just like a mess, right? And so it's like to be able to either yourself be, you know, kind of aware of those things, or like I said, to really seek out the advice or falling in line with and supporting folks that are already, you know, like organizing and have been in that kind of like King of Swords energy for years and years, and being able to be like, wow, I'm really going to defer to you and your knowledge and your expertise in this and support you, because like I want to be able to be a part of like this movement or whatever it is, and keep that energy but channel it in a way that's a little more productive than like just one person, right? Like the woman in the church being like, I'm gonna rip my clothes off, like meow. It was like, well, cool, but like what did that really accomplish, right? Like that was you like centering yourself, and not really accomplishing much traction towards any of the movement that you claim to be like, you know, riled up about. So Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like it's more like self-empowerment, which I think is fine if it's like backed up with something, you
Yeah.
know? So I think that's a great example. And someone I interviewed earlier this year, Saray Jarrell Johnson, Temperance Queer Tarot, they were talking about how like the kind of the concept of like elders and mentorship it has been really lost within spiritual communities, but I think that's been lost within activist communities too. And I know, and I've had this conversation, there are a lot of elders, and people can go back and listen to that episode because we talk about that. But I know in like organizing work, there's been a lot of problematic elders, especially like baby boomer white men who are like really, not very up to date with like what's going on. And they're still like, yeah, they're just like kind of coming from like a really good place, but like it's not. So like I think we do need a mixture of like youth and like youthful energy and like new ideas and the elders, because if the elders are just that's what we have in like the Senate now, it's just all like 75-year-old white men and white people. So it feels like, yeah, I think there is that Knight of Swords does have a role in
For
that vitality. The knights have that role in the vitality of keeping things going and like keeping the king does need the knight, because the
Oh
king
yeah.
needs someone to like update them on like, no, you can't say that word anymore.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
like, no, like a livable wage is not $9 an
Yeah.
hour anymore. You know what I mean? Not that like anybody involved would think that, but just like those kinds of things, like knights do have a role, but knights are not leaders.
Yes.
They're
Yeah.
being groomed to be leaders, I think.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I know.
Well,
I'm like, I feel like we could just talk forever about the
I
swords.
know.
We're
I know. It's great talking to you. And I really appreciate everything you share. And yeah, I mean, it is something that we could talk about. There's so much to it, but I really appreciate the direction this conversation went because I wasn't really sure. I know that you're extremely smart and very
Aw.
charismatic. So I knew this would be a great conversation. I just like wasn't really sure where we would go. And I know we both have a lot to say about the swords. Is there any cards that are, really resonating with you right now?
Um, I'm telling I keep pulling Queen of Swords, which I sound like a broken record, but I think right now, and this, Karina, this may be coming out of left field that I'm like sharing this like, an hour in or something. I lost my mom in January and it was very sudden. And her and I were very, very close. And I feel like am in this weird kind of like limbo period of feeling like my life is just kind of like in shambles and I'm just kind of like riding the waves of like da da da. And I keep pulling Queen of Swords. And I think that it's like this reminder of, like I said, for myself, of like to be able to continue to have that kind of like the power of my ability to see clearly and set boundaries, because as anyone who's experienced loss, there's a lot of drama, like family drama, unfortunately, in like the fallout a lot of times. And I am not an exception to that rule. And I have had a lot of moments of just kind of questioning my entire identity, like the hiatus that I'm taking from my cooking and my like culinary creativity is largely because like that was something that was so intertwined with my mom, right? Like
Mm,
just growing up, like Mexican culture, it was like, matriarch, my grandmother, my mom, like, they were really like the leaders of our household, and it was always food, right? It was always cooking. And like, that part of me has really taken a hit, because now something that I loved and that, had become my profession, I can't really do without feeling like deeply triggered right now.
mm,
And so I've had this again, here I am again, kind of cycling through. It feels like that, the Suit of Swords, of like feeling like I'm again having this like Ten of Swords moment, like ego death of like, well, what the shit? I like built this whole like business, this whole kind of like, and I loved it. Right. But me coming to terms with like, maybe that's a part of me that has to die, or, maybe just through the lens of it being a commodified right thing that I do, right? It may not be something that like I can return to professionally, but I will just, like personally. And I think that like I keep pulling Queen of Swords, one, because I think it's my mom, right? Like she reminded me of that. Like she was very much like badass. Like she, was an academic. She stuck it out. Like, she experienced similar things that I did, but was like, you know what? Like, I'm not gonna leave. I'm staying here basically to say fuck you to all the people that are, like these racist old white men. Like, I'm going to be tenure track professor, and I'm going to like be, like this amazing like academic and really smart and no bullshit and like very direct. And I think she is to me the embodiment of like Queen of Swords energy. And I keep pulling that card. And I think it's kind of, again, speaking to, I'm like going full circle, but it's like speaking to the medicine of just tarot as a personal healing practice. Because like I learned from you in the course, the importance of just like letting, when I pull cards for myself or anyone for that matter, it being like intuitively led and like trusting my intuition. And the fact that I keep pulling that card to me is this kind of like constant reminder of like, you may not feel like this today, but you are this, right? Like this is in your blood. This is like, these strong women that you like came from. Like it's this kind of reminder to me that like I have that within myself and I'm carrying that now. Like my grandmother's gone. That was awful when we lost her. My mom's gone and I'm feeling, a little adrift, not a little, a lot adrift.
Yeah.
And so again, like the medicine in this suit in particular is just like, immense for me, because it's like I keep pulling this card and it's to me this kind of like very loud message from my guides or whatever of being like, you're good, like stay in your power, like don't allow yourself to cycle back to maybe those more toxic iterations of where I landed along the swords journey, right? Like I could very much be in an 8 of Swords moment right now, and sometimes I am, day by day it changes, and sometimes I am in this kind of like I'm fucked and like why am I in a never ending tower moment and like man, and just like not wanting to like be a part of any of it. But I think it's like there's a reason that card keeps getting pulled, right? And I'm trusting that and just like letting that truth be heard by me, which is again, like we talk about, it's like swords always has a very much like hold the mirror up, hard truth, like energy. And I appreciate it though. I like it as someone who, I work well with people that are direct. It's like I work well with the suit that is the most direct.
It sounds too like the Queen of Swords might be your mother's, coming through to like protect you.
For sure.
That's really amazing.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm so grateful to have connected with the swords in the way that I have, and that it's just continuously been this source of like immense healing and kind of like, very cathartic like thing for me. I think it can be for anyone if you have the courage to kind of like jump into it, like start with your Ace of Swords, dip your little toes in, and like trust that the journey will be worth it.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you for talking to me, Christine. It's so good to hear from you, and I love everything that you explained. If anyone wants to get a hold of you, or like is there any like I know you're not really offering anything, but
no. So I, me, because I'm like a creative being, and so it's like I'm already getting restless and I already have like a little baby in the works of like something I want to start offering again soon. So the best thing right now, because I left Instagram years ago.
do you still have an account, or did you delete?
I still have an account.
Okay.
So if you want to find me on Instagram, just so that you are like, here she is, here they are, like, it's Christine Rose Creates on Instagram. But what I was going to say is my website, christinerosecreates.com, and signing up for my email list, and like knowing that like I literally have not sent out an email in like a year and a half. But that is the place that when anything happens and anything new is happening, my email list is always going to be the first folks to hear of it. Since, I don't really use Instagram anymore as like a communication tool. I doubt I'll ever go back to it. But for sure, getting on my email list is a great way to stay in contact. And like, you'll be like, well, I signed up for it and I'm not getting anything. I'll be like, don't you worry. All right. when I'm ready.
I need to sign up for it. I'm gonna do that right after this call.
Oh my God, that's so sweet.
Yeah.
But
Yay,
yeah,
well, awesome. Well, thanks for coming on. I can't wait to share this conversation with everyone.
I know this was so fun. Thank you for having me. This was
course.
hilarious.
I'm gonna